Let's see what else is beginning to work or not working. Hello everyone who's on there, who's joined. Give us like a couple of minutes to get this going. Just testing out Riverside. Okay, I think there are 6 people who have joined from our people who signed up, so that's good. I think now it's going on Twitter also, so people would be able to see. So thank you, Steve, for joining. Just quick background. We came to Dharamshala. So Steve came here to meet Dalai Lama. So it's been an exciting week. There are a lot of founders here who are basically immigrants. So we are talking to them, seeing how we can help them with US immigration. So it's like a great time to have you all also here, who have joined, who are trying to learn about profile building for O1 and EB1A. So, I mean, in the chat, you can ask your questions also in the chat, and we will just like, keep this session more of like focused on your questions. If you have any questions, or just like give you more background about how things are changing for O1 and EB1A. So Steve, like, let's just get started. Maybe like you can give a quick background about kind of like about your firm and what you do, and then we can get into the details.
Sure, and I'm sure some of you have already been with us before, so you might have heard my story, but in essence, I'm an immigrant myself. I'm from Argentina, and I went through a very complicated immigration process when I was a child to finally get my status. And it inspired me to learn more about the law. I ended up getting my degree at Georgetown Law School, and then decided after a brief period of time working for someone else that I really wanted to do my own thing, and that was build an immigration law firm that also concentrates on immigrant founders and immigrant entrepreneurs like myself. And so I've been doing this for 20 years now, and working with people from about 75 different countries. And that's important because there's a lot of different options, but it depends on your nationality, it depends on your experience, depends on if you can get funding. And so even though the law hasn't changed since 1986, each case has to be tailored specifically to the individual because no cases are the same.
So Steve, like, as a part of your practice, what kind of cases do you focus more on?
We predominantly work on O1 cases and EB1A cases, which are extraordinary ability cases.
Mhm.
And then we do a lot of investment-based and entrepreneurial visas, which are the E2 and the L1. So those are for entrepreneurs from specific countries or people who already own or run a company or work for a company overseas and that are expanding. So those are the 4 main visas that we concentrate on.
Got it. So for the purpose of this call, the people who are attending the call, this is like more around learning about O1 on EB1A. I think the first question a lot of people have is like, okay, when we talk about O1 and EB1A, they are definitely extraordinary visas. Now, let's say someone is there who is like, let's say recently graduated or like, early in their career. Do you feel like people can build out good arguments or like a successful case for O1 or EB1A?
I do. I think the more experience you have and the longer track record you have, probably the more resources you have to borrow from in terms of building a case. Like there's one criteria for that's on O1 and also EB1 called lead or critical role in a distinguished organization. That means if you've worked at 3 or 4 or 5 companies and had an important role, that category will be stronger for you.
Mhm.
Whereas if you're a founder of your first business, it's going to be harder to prove that that business is distinguished and you don't have as much evidence to prove it. But that doesn't mean that you can't build around it and build going forward. So the less experience you have, I would say, probably the longer it might take to build your profile,
Mhm.
because you can't invent things that you didn't do, right? So the profile building is really based on the specific accomplishments, and then there are some categories that you really can strive to add, and that's where the profile building comes in, because the language is very clear, and if you're working with a law firm or someone who or a team that knows how the law is being interpreted, then they will know what kind of evidence you need to add to your case.
Got it. So you're saying like anyone can build out an O1 or EB1A profile. Of course, a person who's like starting the career, they might need to do a lot more work to be becoming O1 or EB1A ready, right?
Yeah, like you can get media coverage about telling your story, but if you don't have a story to tell because you don't have experience or you haven't already had success, there's really not enough meat there on the bone for you to get the media article, for example. So you have to build that resume, targeting specific speaking, sorry, judging opportunities, applying for membership in organizations, um, seeing if you can get published, reviewing, peer review of other scholarly articles, things that you volunteer for that might take your time, might require you to travel, but all of those will build that resume.
Got it. So, I mean, I think one question which a lot of people, let's say they are in the early in their career, or like even seen people who have been working for a company for a very long time, they do have like, let's say, critical role because they have been with the company for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, to show some variation in their profile or to build out like, a holistic story, they look for like, should they be doing like projects on the side to improve the profile, or how can they stand out in this kind of environment for their visa?
So you have to understand that having a strong CV in terms of experience or education does not apply to these kinds of cases. You have to build sort of your own alternative CV that's based on the criteria. So what you do is you take the criteria and you start, we call it a roadmap, you start filling that out, and that's where you'll see what things you might qualify under, what things you're missing, and then if you're working with the right people who know how to build it, then you figure out ways to access and add the additional categories. So you have to change your mindset completely and you have to start from a clean slate based on the roadmap and start filling that in. Once you've done that, as you're building your case, you'll see how your case is growing right before your eyes. If you're working with the right people, they'll know when you reach that sort of threshold moment when you have enough to be able to qualify. And the good news is now, as you know, Atal, USCIS is allowing people to set up their own companies to be able to sponsor themselves through those US companies. And so there's one less hurdle, and it's all about showing that you individually meet the requirements.
Got it. Now let me, I think given like, 8 to 10 different categories are there for O1 and EB1A, and we can probably like touch a little bit on each of those categories as well. Like overall, I think my question to you is like, do you see like people applying with 3 categories? Like, I mean, because that is like the qualification criteria, or people usually look for doing more?
So this is the classic quantity versus quality, right? Number one, quantity, you cannot submit a case with less than 3 because then you won't meet the baseline requirement. But I think what we shoot for is 4+ categories because they may try to disqualify one. And if they disqualify one and you only have 3, then you're not going to get approved. Then it's a question of quality. What I've seen in submissions from other attorneys is they go for what's called the kitchen sink approach, and they present, for example, O1A, they present every category. And there's just no real arguments or evidence to sustain half of them. When you present cases that have weak proof, then they are more likely to break down the other categories too, because it looks like you're desperate to do anything you can to get an approval, and that's not the right way. I would rather have 4 categories that are really strong than to have 6 that are weak and 2 that are okay, right? So it's a question of meeting the threshold 1 category at a time.
Got it. Like I have seen people applying for like 6 categories, and sometimes, like I mean, it's very hard to understand even the story of all these six areas. Like they just like put in like, hey, I've been a part of this and this and that. So you're like saying like they might be actually weakening their cases by applying for something more than like the base one, or where they are not good and they're just like adding evidence.
Yeah, the legal standard is called the preponderance of the evidence. So they're looking at it holistically. And if you're making desperate attempts to include categories, like for example, I saw one where the person won the global math competition for people that were 9 to 10 years old or something like that when they were a child prodigy. But they weren't even. It wasn't even the field of endeavor wasn't math, and that's not a professional level award. So if you put that in your petition, you look like you don't understand the law, and you're just throwing yourself at the mercy of USCIS and hoping that you get an approval, and that will not work. You're only as strong as your weakest link. I guess that's the point that I would get across. Do not present categories where the person that's preparing it isn't really had the conviction that you have met the threshold, right? I know people want to fill those holes, but it's all about the quality of the evidence.
Got it. Now let's go into like more of the criteria, right? Like from your perspective, by the way, this workshop is like more for O1 and EB1A both. Like, do you feel like, I mean, in terms of like as we go through the different criterias, do you feel like we should discuss those separately for O1, EB1A, or like they're pretty much can be discussed together one criteria?
Probably it's good to separate, like divide and conquer,
Okay, got it. So let's start with like memberships for O1 visa, right?
Okay.
Like let's start with O1, which is like pretty much like O1, EB1A have decent definitions in a similar way, but I mean, of course, USCIS looks at it differently. If we start with membership for O1, like how do you think like people can build out the memberships?
Yeah, and I would like to say before we jump in is that the O1A has 8 categories, and those 8 categories are almost identical to the EB1A. There are 2 categories in EB1A, which has a total of 10 that are specifically for artists. So that would be O1B parallel, but everything else directly applies. So the good news is if you're building a strong O1 case, you're already building a foundation for EB1. So we don't really need to separate them in our discussion because they are almost exactly the same.
Okay.
So for membership, what's important is that the organizations be national or international in scope, meaning it can't be a regional or state or in the county that you live or the district, depending on what country you're from. It can be any organization anywhere, by the way. It doesn't have to be the US, but it has to be distinguished. And there have to be specific criteria that they use for membership. So it can't be a pay-to-play kind of thing where they don't even screen your application. You pay a fee and you get a membership. It's not exclusive. Exclusive and selectivity are important, and then how distinguished those organizations are. You have to show that you're at the top of your field. So they most likely will know if that organization exists, and they'll already have it sort of earmarked as being prestigious enough or not. But you cannot just join any sort of local organization, and it has to be in your field. And I say this all the time, once you define your field, that's when you start doing a logistical sort of methodical approach in terms of choosing. So if you are in computer science, then maybe you apply for IEEE. You do, artificial intelligence, you apply for AAAI. If you're in tech, you can apply for Forbes Tech Council. Those are just some of the things that we see often. You have to be strategic about it. And we have to have a confirmation letter. They like to see bylaws. It's about outstanding achievement. They need to require outstanding achievement of their members. So that's the most important thing.
Got it. So now I think one question a lot of people have is like, of course, let's say they are looking at AI or like, let's say computer science is a field where they are applying. I mean, of course, there are a few places they can become a member, but they might find memberships which are actually not in these fields. Do you think they need to have memberships actually in the field they're applying, like the field of endeavor, or it doesn't matter?
It absolutely matters. So we had a case where it was for an O1B where the woman was a drummer. She was from China. She was also a model and was featured in Elle magazine. So she said, could you show the feature in this magazine, which is major media for that category of media or articles about someone. But it was for a model. It was for her as a model, and we presented her as a musician. Once you choose the field of endeavor, that's all the evidence has to be inside the same basket. So what we do is we frame it in the most general way possible. So if they are an AI specialist, we present it in computer science. And then any organization that has to do with computer engineering, computer science, or even AI could work. But if you say the person's an AI specialist or that's their field of endeavor, then organizations that are broader than that, you can't use them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's about defining the field is the most important thing. Everything outside that field does not apply to the case.
Got it. So in a way, you are saying, I mean, define the field better, and you cannot go out of that field to have a membership. Like you cannot be like in a very different area and still be able.
Yeah, like people are Phi Beta Kappa at their school, or
Yeah.
they're a fellow, something else, some other discipline, or people say I'm a Mensa scholar.
Mhm.
I've heard of all of these, right?
Yeah.
Nothing to do with their field. We can't use it. You can put it in their bio, but they're not going to pay attention to that. They're going to look you want to be as simplistic as you can and always keep everything within each box.
Got it. Now let's talk about the next criteria, like the awards. I think there was like a time when people used to add like let's say a funding and all as awards. What do you think is like true definition of an award?
Number one, an award has to be an individual award. So when people were applying, for example, as a member an award winner from Y Combinator because they got $500,000 from Y Combinator, it was actually their company that was winning it. The letters were saying that they were individual award winners. That was passing muster a year ago. But right now, they're not looking at funding as an award anymore because it became so common for people to present it. And that's where the needle is always moving until like what I'm saying today, if we do this session a year from now, it probably will be different. So awards are much harder to get now. I think the best award you can get is a fellowship. If you are chosen as a fellow, like a Thiel Fellowship, for example, is a really strong award, or something called the Maverick Next Award, or one of these that is international in scope and is very selective, and it's an individual award. It's not a team award. It's not one exception for the EB1A is if you work at a larger company and you win an annual internal award. Because it's such a big organization, if it's a multinational company, then it technically qualifies as a multinational prestigious award. But those are much harder to get. You have to shoot for the stars on those. It's not just some basic thing or some pitch night that you won. It has to be something really, really elite level.
Got it. So it looks like award definitely it needs to be very, very selective international award for someone to be able to make a mark there.
Yes.
Now let's talk about the third criteria, which is like judging. What do you see like what goes into judging?
So what was happening in the last few years was that hackathons were becoming this sort of ubiquitous thing where there was a hackathon every week. So people started applying with hackathons to prove they were judges. And then what happened was they started coming up with a real list of the most prestigious ones, right? So Hack Harvard, MIT Hacks, Cal Berkeley, AI Hackathon, the Stanford Tree Hacks, things like that were associated with prestigious research and tech universities. Some international ones, but the US ones, I think that they probably have more weight, they're more known. And now the new trends are more going back to the traditional definition of judging of your peers, which is peer review. There's nothing more pure when it comes to the language of the regulations than looking at and reviewing other people's scholarly articles or their submissions for professional conferences. If you can do either one of those, then you can qualify. All you need is a certificate and a confirmation letter, right? So a lot of these conferences, people don't want to review all the submissions for them because they're highly technical. They're very, very, full of information. They take a long time to review, but it's a great way to secure that category because that is the most traditional way to qualify. So whatever your field is, like we always say, start looking. Like if you're in the field of business and you say Harvard Business Journal, I want to review submissions for your next edition, and they let you, then you've got that category in the bag.
Got it. So you are saying peer reviewing papers and all, I mean, that definitely is a good criteria for someone to like think about building on that.
Yeah, you use all your contacts, your friends' contacts. If you went to a specific school and they have a journal, if there are conferences that are really important in your field and people
Mhm.
present papers and they publish them,
Mhm.
then then sign up, volunteer, put in however many tens or dozens of hours you have to put in to do it, but it should help you get that category.
Got it. The next criteria we have is like high salary. And I think the confusion what a lot of pop people have around high salary is like, okay, how do I know if I have actually high salary or not? Like, so how do you think people can understand?
Okay, so the good news is it's not just high salary, it's high salary or other remuneration.
Mhm.
What does that mean? That means that if you worked, for example, as an engineer, engineers are extremely well paid in the US.
Mhm.
So if you're a software engineer at LinkedIn and you make $300,000 or $400,000 a year, and then you get bonuses and things like that, or you have equity that's paid out, you can use the total compensation for the whole year,
Mhm.
and then you compare that to the labor statistics that are published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is part of Department of Labor. Compare that to the salary in the region where you live.
Mhm.
I think the average was something like 212,000 last year for
Mhm.
software engineers. So if you're making more than that in your total compensation, we can still make an argument that you meet that. It's much easier, Atal, if you're in the US for proving compensation.
Mhm. Mhm.
Why?
Mhm.
A lot of our clients have not worked in the US yet. That's why they're applying for O1.
Mhm.
So that means you have to show that in your home country or whichever country you were living in,
Mhm.
that your salary was well above
Mhm.
that, 10th, it's that last 10th percentile that you want to be in.
Mhm.
So the question becomes, depending on where you're from, how reliable is the information?
Mhm.
Sometimes we use what are called compensation experts,
Mhm.
people who have degrees and their profession is to testify about compensation.
Mhm.
So if you're in India and you're a software engineer and you're making X,
Mhm.
and the 90th percentile is X minus 5 or something, you need to be able to prove that that salary or compensation is above that, 90th percentile. If you can do that, it doesn't matter that you never worked in the US. So we've had clients that worked in places like the Republic of Georgia,
Mhm.
where they made 1/5, let's say, what they would have made in America, but they made 3 times as much as people make in Georgia.
Mhm.
So you're not disqualified because your salary was elsewhere. The question is, how do you prove where that compares to your peers in the same job?
Hmm. Got it. So it's like salary in the region, in the job, in your compared to your peers is like how it's kind of looked at.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Correct. The next criteria, I mean, I think we touched a little bit about the that critical role that is there. Like, how can someone, I mean, let's say someone is an engineer, like, how can they define their role as like a critical role? Like, how is critical role criteria defined?
Yeah, I don't want to give away all our trade secrets, but one thing that we do, and it's based on what's exactly the language in the statute, is
Mhm.
you have to be what's called critical to the overall success of the company.
Mhm.
But the statute says that can also be critical to the success of a division or department of the company.
Mhm.
So if you're a software engineer and you work at a massive company, you can't say that you have a critical role in the overall success of the company because it's not a reasonable argument.
Mhm.
But if you're in a very sort of niche sub department that does one specific thing,
Mhm.
and you are like the senior engineer and you have the supervisor write a letter talking about how you improved a product or you increased the number of users or whatever is something tangible, an effect
Mhm.
that can be measured, then you can make that argument and then you can show that you were critical in
Mhm.
that role. For your future work,
Mhm.
if you're a founder, that's pretty easy to make the
Mhm.
argument because you're going to be CFO, CIO, CTO, or CEO probably, right?
Mhm.
Which means you just have to define the duties really well. The hard part is showing distinguished reputation of that company.
Mhm.
And the way you do that usually is you can then bring in the funding and show where it came from, the profile of the investors. You can show, what the media coverage about
Mhm.
the organization is.
Mhm.
And then that will prove distinguished reputation because it's a two-pronged requirement. It's critical role in an organization of distinguished reputation. So the hardest part is getting both those prongs.
Distinguished reputation as well as a critical role, and you are saying the start for startup founders, it could be more through proving the investors that they have, maybe like even media can help, right?
And media can help. Media is king. Media, we haven't talked about that category yet, but that is, to me, the strongest of all the categories because it legitimizes everything else. So if you have media about you in major media or major trade like tech or business publications, you will qualify, but it also talks about your business and it talks about the judging you did, and if it talks about the memberships you have, it's legitimizing all the other categories.
Got it. So let's get into media. I think media as a criteria. I mean, I think people sometimes say like, "Hey, apply without media." I mean, what are you seeing as like the trend around media?
I've never submitted a case. I've done, I don't know, somewhere around 500 cases of these kinds. And I've only submitted a case without media if the person is a researcher that's published or a scientist that's patented things. Because then you usually have enough for critical role, original contributions. Otherwise, you have to step out of the shadows. We talked about, Tal and I talk about this. A lot of engineers are kind of timid and introverted, but they have to step out of the shadows a little bit and get some of that media about them to solidify their cases.
Got it. So how should someone look at the media as a criteria? Like how can someone build out their case around it?
Yeah, I think that's the most challenging thing for this category. But at the same time, compared to when I started practicing, there's probably 20 times as many sources to be published in. Because now we have, it's not, the statute talks about publications meaning print, but that includes digital and online media. And now there's a proliferation of media sources. And it's important people understand this. This does not have to be in the US. We got a case approved last year where the person was from Norway. They had 4 publications about them in 4 Norwegian publications that were, high level. What you need to do is make sure that there is information available about the circulation or the number of visitors, monthly visitors, what that footprint is to prove that it's a major media source.
Got it. Now the next question that I have is like, I think we can go over a couple of other criteria. One is original contribution. I think I will just go into what problem people see with original contribution. Like they have worked in the industry for a very long time, created a lot of value, but now one challenge is like, first of all, they have to take permission from the company to be able to even share any of that information out. The other is like they feel like, okay, the work was great, but like if someone is an engineer, their work was never in the public eye. So how can someone build out an argument around original contribution?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that this is the most difficult category, in my opinion, to get. For compensation, it's black or white. If you've made, you're in the top 10% of where you're from and you can prove what other people make, it's just numbers. The numbers don't lie. In this case, this is a much broader argument. So let's think about critical role first. Critical role is talking about the impact you had internally. You might not have impacted anyone or anything outside of that company, but if you were critical to the success of that company, you can qualify if it's distinguished. Original contributions has 2 parts. It's original contributions of major significance, and it's significance in the field, which means you have to show that whatever you created impacted the entire field of computer science or entire field of business. And that is extremely difficult to do. How do you do it? The most cited way to show it that you see from USCIS is if you have a patent in your name, and you can show that that patent is implemented, used by others, right? If there's a scholarly article you wrote, and we haven't talked about, it's the one that's missing, scholarly articles. If you've written a scholarly article that talks about the technology that you've patented, and it talks about the impact, then all you need to do is find and line up a few subject matter experts who are aligned with that specialization to confirm the originality and the impact. And then you have a solid case. So this is great for people who have patents, who are academics, researchers, as long as you can show impact. So if you're a researcher and you've published articles, that's where your citations are important, like Google citations. How many people have been impacted is literally right there in the numbers. So people who do not have this don't feel bad. I would say we probably present this in 10% of our cases. It's the most difficult to prove because it's not just taking the CEO's word for it that in the company it had this impact. It's showing the impact globally, essentially, or within your entire field. That's really hard to do.
Got
And
it.
if you have that, you really have a good EB1 case.
So like if someone does not have like you are saying like skip this criteria out if you don't have a very strong argument and apply with other categories, or like what do you think, like let's say someone does not have it from their job, do you feel like is there a way someone can work around this criteria or like improve it?
I would say focus on strengthening other categories. As you say, as we say in the legal field, you have to choose your battles, and you can't win every battle. The only battle that is important here is really the war, the overall war. The war is getting an approval, right? And you fight each battle differently. Each case we present is fought differently. It's presented differently. We emphasize the strengths of the case. They're not going to see an empty original contributions part of your petition because you're not even going to mention it. You're just going to say, these are the categories we're presenting. And you present them well.
Got it. Let's talk about the last criteria, which is authorship, authorship of scholarly article. And I think there are two perspectives. One is like people who actually write papers. So I mean, I think for them this criteria becomes easier. Let's talk about people who are like working in tech, let's say engineering roles or product roles, or more of sales roles. How do they look at this criteria of authorship?
Well, there's an interesting nuance to this, is that the language says authorship of scholarly articles in professional journals or major media or major trade. So people often confuse this with media about the individual in major media, major trade. It's different. This is things that you write. What does this mean? This means if you're a guru in sales, like you mentioned, and you're writing in Forbes or you're writing in International Business Tribune or anything that has to do with business or entrepreneurship, then you can qualify even though it's not a scholarly journal. The thing is, what they're looking for is a scholarly journal type article, if that makes sense. So you're not just writing a blog that's published in major media. You're writing something that could be perceived as scholarly, and that means you should be citing. You should have citations. Even if it's 7 paragraphs, you have 3 or 4 citations that cite, legitimate sources about your expertise. Then they'll see it as scholarly. That's the key here. So it doesn't have to be in a scholarly publication, but it has to be scholarly in nature, if that makes sense. And that's a nuance that a lot of people do not capture.
I think I'm also trying to understand, like when you say it should be scholarly in nature, you are saying salesperson writing in a trade, let's say, is scholarly in nature. Like how are you defining that kind of
because they're putting citations in their work.
Putting citations.
So they're saying this I don't know, like this CRM's technology is being used by this Salesforce for this, and this started in 97 when this happened, and they cited one, Crane's Business Journal, 1997 or whatever. They're using citations like it was a university kind of academic paper written in a more traditional or mainstream publication. So it's not something that you see very often, but it's tailored to that audience. It's high level and it has some citations in it. If they can do that, then it doesn't necessarily have to be in a scholarly publication. If people love to write, though, all you have to do is write. It could be a white paper that then becomes articles, like chapters of a white paper, and then you just have to go out and offer that content to scholarly publications, because they're all competing now for content, And that's why I was talking about putting in the effort, right? If you
Yeah.
love to write and you can do it on a high level, then you just need to find a place to publish it.
Got it. I think I'm seeing like couple of questions from people. Maybe like we can start with this
Sure.
question here. So the question is like, what if you have enough media but salary below 212K average, for example, that you mentioned, like media is there, salary is not there. What do you think?
Well, it's okay if salary is not there. And remember, it depends on how you define your field.
Mhm.
So you're comparing yourself to other people in the same field in similar positions, right?
Mhm.
So if you have if just this person saying that they have a salary means that they've been employed, which means you probably can argue critical role. And if you have, critical role and you have media, that probably means that you're eligible for membership, and certainly you can offer your services to be a judge or do peer review.
Mhm.
So it's not, don't worry about the ones you don't qualify for. Once you've excluded those,
Mhm.
then you concentrate on building the other categories. Like I said, you don't have to qualify in every. And a lot of people, especially young founders, they have no chance of qualifying for salary.
Mhm.
One footnote is the statute does talk about future salaries,
Mhm. Mhm.
but they're very picky about future offers of employment. They want to see the person's actually made that money at some level
Mhm.
before they think it's legitimate. Because then you could just have your company that's sponsoring your petition just make up a salary that's above the 90th percentile,
Mhm.
and then everybody would do that, right? So
Mhm.
proof of real compensation in the past is much more convincing.
Got it. Let's see the other question. How do you see Trump's future policy on visa and allocation for jobs and education?
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a very it's a very complex question. I think that the issue with this administration is that I do not believe that the president nor his team have a clearly defined path. The first Trump administration talked about a meritocracy or a merit-based system. We haven't heard that language this time. They're on the fence about what to do with H-1Bs, which is related to education. It's the only visa that requires a certain level of education. That and the TN and the E3, which are all similar based on education. But the rest of them, like O1, we don't have any inkling right now as to where they're going with this. And so it's very hard because we have to analyze how things are evolving. For now, what I would say to people is, this is not something you can take lightly. You have to present the strongest case possible because there certainly will be more opposition and probably lower approval rates with this administration than we've seen in the previous one.
Got it. Um, this is like the last question that we can take today. I think my laptop might power off might in a bit. So I work in product development for medical devices. I have a master's degree in mechanical engineering, pursuing PhD in business. How do I choose a field of work? Where can I find resources for people with hardware background?
Yeah, I mean that's a tough question. People who have are versatile and have changed tracks, um, you have to analyze holistically what the other categories look like, what other accomplishments you have, what other possibilities of adding categories is based on which direction you go. And I think that generally I would say if you want to work in a specific field in the future, that's the one that you should use as your field of endeavor, right? If you in a previous sort of iteration or career you were in one field, if there's no way to sort of unify your experience under one umbrella, go with the one that you're most interested in working in the future, and then build your case around that.
Got it. Awesome. I think before my laptop actually shuts off, otherwise recording will go away. I think for the other people who do have questions, you can reach out to Steve or me. You signed up on our event.